I'm your host Timothy, and welcome to Last Memories. Join me as I uncover the stories of the worst deaths in live TV history. From an actor who stepped onto a rigged platform, laughing off warnings the crew gave him, to a street performer who took juggling machetes onto a live broadcast, only for it to end in a horrifying way. It was August 3rd, 2018, at a local television station in Columbus, Ohio. The afternoon had started normally enough, but by 3 o'clock, the storm system moving across the city had become the lead story. Lightning was visible to the west, and the radar was showing the kind of activity that pushed weather coverage to the front of every broadcast. Adrian Cole was 41 years old and had spent 12 years reading forecasts and explaining weather systems to viewers across central Ohio. That morning, he had been told informally that he was being moved up to lead on-air severe weather coverage, a step he had been working toward for some time. His colleagues had congratulated him in the newsroom. It had been a good day up until the point it stopped being one. I keep thinking about that morning. The congratulations, the handshakes, the feeling of finally getting somewhere. And then a colleague calls in sick and everything that follows from that single phone call. The meteorologist originally scheduled for the Rooftop Live segment had called in sick that afternoon with food poisoning. Someone needed to take the slot, and Adrian agreed without hesitation. It aligned with his new role, and it was exactly the kind of high-profile segment he had been waiting for. The technical setup on the rooftop was already in place from the previous segment. Nobody changed anything before he went up. The rooftop was a standard broadcast environment. Camera equipment, lighting rigs, and a fixed transmission tower anchored to the structure. The tower had been serviced 2 days earlier. During that maintenance, the grounding system had been adjusted and the bonding connection had been left incomplete. No post-maintenance verification or grounding check had been conducted before the rooftop setup was used again. From the outside, there was no way to see the problem. This is the part that gets under my skin. 2 days earlier, someone worked on that tower, packed up their tools, and left. And nobody went back up to check, not once. The lightning had been visible at a distance, but had not yet been recorded within the station's established safety radius at the time the segment began. Whether due to a delay in monitoring updates or a misjudgment of the storm's speed, the decision was made to proceed. Adrian took his position and started the live broadcast. He was composed and clear, tracking the storm in real time for viewers at home. The camera framing and fixed cabling position placed him within a few feet of the tower base. The control room was monitoring the feed from below. Lightning activity entered the immediate area as conditions rapidly worsened. A discharge struck the tower directly during the segment. Under normal conditions, a properly grounded tower dissipates that energy safely into the earth. In this case, the incomplete bonding meant the electricity did not spread out safely, which made the area more dangerous. A side flash happened where electricity jumped from the tower to nearby metal parts, and Adrian was caught in that path for a split second. On the live broadcast, his speech stopped mid-sentence. He lost posture immediately. The control room cut the feed within seconds, and backup programming took over. Viewers watching across the city saw it happen before the cut. The rooftop crew reached him within moments. Emergency services were contacted immediately, and paramedics arrived within minutes. Adrian was found unresponsive in cardiac arrest, and resuscitation efforts were initiated at the scene, but he was later pronounced dead. He was 41 years old. The cause of death was recorded as cardiac arrest due to lightning strike with associated electrical injuries. Technical investigators examining the tower determined that the grounding system had been left in a non-compliant state following the maintenance carried out 2 days before the incident. The incomplete bonding connection had prevented the tower from safely dissipating the lightning energy. While not the sole cause, this significantly increased the risk by reducing proper energy dissipation. The maintenance contractor and the station's technical team were named in the subsequent investigation. Adrian Cole had stepped in for a colleague, taken a position he had just been promoted to fill, and walked onto a rooftop beside a tower that nobody had checked before sending him up. He did not even hesitate when they asked him. That is what stays with me.
It was April 10th, 2017 on a live comedy broadcast stage in Osaka, Japan, where a man who had spent years learning to make people laugh walked onto a platform that nobody had properly tested, and the last sound the studio audience heard from him was not a punchline. Hiroto Nishimura was 28 years old and worked as a stage actor with a regional theater company in Osaka. He had been performing since his early 20s, mostly in comedic ensemble roles. Outside his main work, he ran a small independent comedy collective with 3 friends and had been planning their first full production for months. He had joined the variety program specifically for the appearance fee, which friends said he intended to put toward venue rental costs. Unfortunately, that was the whole reason he was there. He was known on set for almost never refusing a physical bit. Directors who had worked with him described him as a yes person, the one who took the falls, wore the awkward costumes, stayed for the late reshoot. A production assistant who had worked with him on a prior segment told investigators Hiroto had a tendency to wave off safety briefings, not from carelessness exactly, but from a genuine trust in production crews. That morning, a crew member told him directly to test the platform before stepping onto it. Based on what I've read, it's not sure if he acknowledged it or not. What I do know is that the recording stage was an indoor studio facility in central Osaka. The segment was built around a tremor simulation gag, using a motorized platform designed to tilt subtly beneath a contestant while pre-recorded earthquake audio played through the speakers. Investigators later determined the motor had been misaligned during assembly the previous day, causing the platform to tilt at approximately 18 degrees at peak movement, more than 4 times the intended range. A camerawoman named Keiko had noticed a slight shift in the support frame during a pre-show run-through, but assumed it was deliberate. About 40 seconds before recording officially began, the stage manager called for a hold. The floor director acknowledged it, but failed to immediately and clearly relay the stop to the talent area, which would be required in a real production. Hiroto stepped onto the center of the platform, still smiling. The audience built into cheers around him. 2 crew members near the motor housing later said they knew something was wrong, but nobody stopped filming. At this point, I'm looking at what I'm reading and screaming internally. Why would they not stop? The motor engaged. The platform reached its maximum tilt in approximately 1.1 seconds. Hiroto's right foot lost contact with the surface first. His body weight dropped forward over his left knee, and when that foot slid too, there was some reflexive flailing of his arms, but not enough to regain balance. He went down face first. His forehead struck the concrete lip at the platform's front edge, where the rubber safety mat had been cut short during installation, leaving roughly 4 inches of bare concrete exposed. The impact was audible on the studio recording. Hiroto did not move after the impact. A production assistant near the camera bay described a spreading dark stain that reached the platform edge within seconds. Keiko reacted immediately to the fall, but had a brief moment of hesitation as the scene unfolded, filming for approximately 2 to 3 seconds before lowering her camera. 2 cast members rushed onto the platform. One knelt beside Hiroto and checked his airway. A second called emergency services from the stage floor. The control room switched the broadcast to a static card within seconds. Emergency responders arrived in 6 minutes. Hiroto was transported immediately and declared dead before reaching the hospital. The coroner determined cause of death to be severe traumatic brain injury from blunt force impact to the frontal skull. Hiroto's comedy collective held a quiet memorial at their studio the following week and suspended all activity for a month. His family filed a legal claim against the production company, citing the misaligned motor, the unprotected concrete edge, and the failure to halt recording after the stage manager's call. The court ultimately found partial liability, acknowledging that while Hiroto had been verbally advised to test the platform, production safety oversights contributed to the accident, and a settlement was reached rather than a full exoneration of the company. That ruling sits badly with me. Warning someone once and then allowing filming to continue while crew members are already exchanging looks about a malfunctioning motor. That is not an assumption of risk. That is a room full of people who made a choice to keep going.
It was August 14th, 2018, in Naperville, Illinois. The afternoon sun was still high when the production vans pulled up along the quiet suburban street, crew members unloading camera rigs and running cables through the front door of the newly renovated home. The final reveal was being broadcast live. Evan Cole, 34, was a camera operator for a home makeover production company. He had spent years on renovation shoots, moving through tight spaces and active construction zones without incident. That afternoon, he was positioned inside the house ahead of the host, ready to capture the tracking shots during the final reveal walkthrough. The live broadcast added pressure to keep the shoot moving without interruption. interruption. Those who worked with him noted he was disciplined with his positioning, keeping movements controlled and predictable, even in tight or active environments. What Evan did not know, and this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable, was that the wall removed during the renovation had not been non-load-bearing the way the production team had classified it. It had been providing partial structural support to the ceiling above the open living area. Temporary jack posts had been placed after the wall came down, but removed before the replacement beam was fully secured. The beam itself had been set in place, but not fully integrated into a continuous load path, with critical fasteners not yet installed, and one end lacking proper bearing support. No licensed structural engineer had signed off on the modification before filming resumed. As a result, the structure had been carrying load without adequate support for days, with weight partially redistributed across elements not designed to sustain it. The decision to proceed had been made under production pressure, with the timeline taking priority over structural verification. During my research, I discovered that this was not a hidden problem. The people on that production knew the temporary supports had come out before the permanent beam was ready. They kept the schedule anyway. By the time filming began, the ceiling had already been under uneven stress. Drywall seams along the modified section had begun to separate, and fine cracks had formed along joint lines, indicating movement in the structure above. What gets me is that the signs were already there. The ceiling was telling people something was wrong. The warning signs were subtle enough to be mistaken for normal settling, and with a live audience watching, no one stopped to investigate them. As the walkthrough began, Evan moved slowly backward through the open living area, carefully navigating cables and unfinished flooring, keeping the host in frame. His attention remained fixed on maintaining composition and stability. Faint creaking came from the joints overhead. Small particles of dust fell from the ceiling, and this is the part I find hardest to sit with. By this point, it was already too late. The structure had already entered a critical state, with remaining supports carrying loads beyond their intended capacity, and no margin left for stability. The ceiling above the modified span failed at one connection point first, then propagated across the unsupported section. The partially installed beam and unsupported joists dropped into the collapse zone where Evan was standing. The impact caused severe blunt force trauma to his head, neck, and upper body. He sustained a traumatic brain injury, multiple spinal fractures, and crush injuries to his chest. He was unconscious when the debris settled. The live feed cut abruptly, though viewers briefly saw the collapse before the broadcast was terminated. Crew members outside called emergency services immediately. Fire responders arrived within several minutes, securing the scene and checking for secondary collapse risk before making entry. Evan was found unresponsive beneath the debris. Despite emergency intervention at a nearby trauma center, his injuries were not survivable. Evan Cole was pronounced dead that evening. Structural inspectors and engineers later confirmed the wall had been misclassified and the temporary supports removed before the permanent beam was secured. No structural sign-off had been obtained before the space was cleared for filming. The production company had proceeded with a live broadcast in a structurally compromised space on a timeline that did not allow the work to be properly completed. And the part that I find hardest to sit with is that Evan Cole had no reason to question any of it. Cole had simply shown up to do his job. He never went home. It was August 17th, 2013, in Miami, Florida. A live morning television segment was underway in the outdoor parking area of a regional broadcast studio, where a heat endurance stunt had been set up for continuous on-air coverage. A transparent, custom-built sauna enclosure stood on a raised platform, surrounded by cameras, lighting stands, and monitoring screens displaying internal temperature and elapsed time. Rebecca Martinez, 29, was the program's co-host and a regular participant in challenge-based segments designed to boost ratings and viewer engagement. She had built a reputation for completing physically demanding stunts on air, including endurance dances and food challenges. For this broadcast, she proposed an extended sauna endurance attempt tied to a charity fundraiser and an unofficial record benchmark. Production planning documents describe the segment as high risk but manageable with medical standby, hydration supply, and continuous visual monitoring. The enclosure was a modified heat chamber, built with thick transparent polycarbonate panels and a framed door fitted with an outward opening latch and magnetic seal. Portable heaters and steam units were positioned outside the chamber and vented inward through heat-rated ducts. A digital sensor array displayed air temperature and humidity on a broadcast overlay. Target temperature was set between 165 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit, within the upper operating range of commercial saunas, but higher than typical televised demonstrations. On-site medics were assigned to observe for heat illness indicators and were authorized to recommend termination if preset thresholds were crossed. Rebecca entered the chamber shortly after 9 a.m., wearing light athletic clothing and a biometric wrist monitor. Water bottles and electrolyte drinks were placed inside within reach. During the first 90 minutes, she remained alert and responsive, periodically signaling status to the crew through hand gestures and brief microphone responses. Internal readings showed stable temperature but rising humidity, as steam output accumulated faster than expected under the sealed configuration. Later review found the chamber's ventilation slot had been partially obstructed by a camera cable repositioned for a tighter shot. As the second hour passed, Rebecca's movement slowed and her posture changed from upright to seated against the rear panel. According to the medic log, her gestures became less consistent and response delays increased. These signs were initially attributed to normal fatigue under heat exposure. The stunt clock remained active because her biometric readings, though elevated, had not yet crossed the automatic abort threshold set during pre-show planning. Near the 2-hour mark, Rebecca attempted to stand and lost balance. The live camera feed showed uncoordinated movement followed by collapse onto the chamber floor. The supervisor ordered an immediate stop. When crew attempted to open the door, the magnetic seal did not release on the first trigger. Heat expansion along the frame increased seal pressure, requiring a manual override pull from the hinge side. Entry was gained after several seconds, and medics removed her from the chamber and began active cooling procedures on site before transport. Martinez was pronounced dead at the hospital later that day. The medical report listed exertional heat stroke with multi-organ complications as the cause of death. The post-incident review cited contributing factors including elevated humidity from restricted ventilation, abort thresholds set too high for a sealed environment, and a door seal design that did not account for thermal expansion under sustained peak heat. Broadcast safety guidance issued afterward required redundant ventilation clearance checks, lower automatic abort limits, and non-magnetic quick-release door hardware for all live heat endurance segments. It was September 9, 2018, when the Outdoor Food Festival in southwestern Arizona was reaching its peak afternoon energy. The desert sun blazed overhead at 102 degrees, casting harsh shadows across the vendor booths and performance stages scattered throughout the dusty fairgrounds. Local television crews had set up equipment near the main cooking demonstration area, where the smell of grilled meats and spiced vegetables mixed with the dry desert air. Teague Mull was 41 years old and had spent most of his adult life working temporary food stalls across desert fairs and weekend festivals. After leaving a warehouse job a decade earlier, he built his small business around portable propane burners and simple street dishes, often repairing and reusing his own equipment to keep costs low. Friends knew him as careful and routine-driven, someone who trusted the same worn tools he had relied on for years. That morning, Teague had been invited to participate in a live cooking segment for a local television station. The opportunity represented a significant boost for his small business. He arrived early to set up his portable cooking station, which consisted of a folding table, a high-output propane burner, and the necessary gas connections. The propane system had been assembled quickly using equipment that had seen extensive use. The rubber hose connecting the tank to the burner showed signs of wear, with small cracks visible along its length. The regulator had been swapped out from another setup without proper testing. As the afternoon segment began, Teague positioned himself behind the cooking table with the propane tank beneath the work surface. The camera operator focused on the demonstration while festival attendees gathered around. A faint odor of gas lingered near the burner, masked by the food aromas throughout the festival grounds. The propane had been leaking slowly from the damaged hose connection, collecting briefly beneath the table before warm air currents and foot traffic dispersed it into the open air. The leak remained undetected as Teague prepared his ingredients and explained his cooking process. When Teague reached for the burner's ignition switch, the escaping propane ignited immediately. The flames spread rapidly back to the damaged hose. Within seconds, the weakened hose ruptured completely, creating a continuous torch of burning propane that sprayed upward across the cooking station. The sustained jet of flame engulfed Teague's torso, arms, and face as his clothing ignited instantly. The ruptured hose sprayed burning propane across the cooking station, forcing him to stagger backward in panic. He collapsed onto the stage platform and stopped moving as the fire continued feeding from the open line. Festival staff rushed forward with fire extinguishers, but several seconds passed before they could shut off the gas at the tank valve. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes and found Teague unresponsive with no detectable pulse. Resuscitation efforts continued on the stage as crews shut down the burning equipment. Teague was pronounced dead at the scene from catastrophic thermal burns and inhalation of superheated gases. The investigation later confirmed that a cracked propane hose caused the leak and rupture. Festival officials suspended all live cooking demonstrations and introduced mandatory equipment inspections. The live broadcast captured the ignition, the burst of flame, and Teague's collapse before the control room cut the feed. Later that evening, the station confirmed on air that the vendor had died at the scene, closing one of the few broadcasts in which a fatal accident was witnessed live. It was August 18, 2018, in downtown Columbus, Ohio. Morning traffic moved steadily beneath an enclosed high-rise under active construction. Cranes paused between lifts, and a local television crew prepared for a scheduled live safety segment. The scene appeared controlled, while height, wind, and timing narrowed the margin for error. Marco DeLuca was 52, a construction foreman from Northwest Ohio. He had spent more than 3 decades on job sites, starting as a laborer and advancing to supervisor for a regional union-affiliated concrete and structural steel contractor. He was known for arriving before dawn, leaving after paperwork was finished, and addressing hazards directly. Workers described him as blunt, methodical, and consistent. His routine included handwritten logs, double-checking delivery slips, questioning optimistic projections, and requiring harnesses even for short tasks. Work was paused when conditions fell outside site limits. The interview was scheduled after recent safety concerns at unrelated projects owned by the same developer drew public attention, and the company agreed to a live segment to address those concerns. The interview took place on the 40th floor, where temporary exterior scaffolding supported facade and window installation. At that height, the wind shifted in uneven bursts. The platform relied on bolted connections tightened earlier in the week after a scaffold adjustment for material delivery. Marco's safety harness was clipped to a designated tie-off point on the same scaffold section, creating a common point failure when the platform gave way. A safety note recorded inconsistent torque readings on several fasteners, with retesting scheduled for the following day to avoid delaying concrete work below. That morning, a regional heat advisory and moderate wind warning were in effect, but filming proceeded. The segment aired live, and the reporter requested a clear view of the safety setup. Marco stood near the edge so the scaffold, guardrails, and tie-off points were visible behind him, while work on the platform was paused. As the interview continued on the live broadcast, crane activity resumed above to reposition materials. The movement sent vibrations through the structure and into the scaffold. At the connection points behind Marco, washers compressed and shifted around bolt heads, later confirmed to be under-torqued. The sounds blended with wind and traffic. The failure began abruptly. A sharp metallic snap cut through the audio as 2 bolts sheared almost simultaneously. Viewers saw the platform drop several inches and lurch. Marco stepped back as the guardrail bent outward and the decking tilted. Marco fell from the edge in full view of the live broadcast. He struck lower structural elements during the fall and then disappeared from the frame. Seconds later, a heavy impact sound reached the microphones, and the broadcast cut away. Emergency services were called immediately. Police, fire, and medical units arrived within minutes and secured the site. Marco was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as massive blunt force trauma, with crushed chest and pelvis, ruptured internal organs, and fatal spinal injuries. Investigators determined the collapse resulted from improperly torqued bolts that failed under combined vibration and wind load, with heat noted as a contributing factor to material stress. The site was shut down for several weeks. Fines were issued, inspection protocols were revised, and the broadcast footage was preserved as evidence and later used in internal safety briefings.
It was November 12, 2016, at a television studio in Atlanta, Georgia. The morning show was running its usual rotation of segments, moving quickly between news, weather, and lifestyle content. The cooking demonstration was scheduled mid-hour, a regular feature that kept the energy up between harder news items. Braden Lee was 29 years old and had been with the program for 3 years. He was comfortable in front of the camera in the way that comes from doing something every day until it stops feeling like work. That evening, he had dinner plans with his fiancée at a seafood restaurant he had been wanting to try. He had mentioned it to a colleague before the show started. He was looking forward to it. 29, engaged, dinner plans he was looking forward to. These details don't make it more tragic. They just remind you this was a Tuesday morning for him. The segment involved a guest chef preparing a dish on set while the hosts engaged with the process and tasted the food on camera. A prep rundown had been circulated before the show listing the ingredients. Sesame oil was included as a finishing ingredient. It was not verbally flagged or emphasized during the rundown. Braden had a known sesame allergy, known to some colleagues, but not formally logged in production or safety documentation. His epinephrine auto-injector had been left in his dressing room and was not immediately accessible on set. The chef prepared the dish. A portion was plated by the food stylist and handed to Braden on cue. He tasted it on camera. The segment continued normally for the first few minutes. Then he cleared his throat. Then again. His voice shifted slightly, a subtle change in tone that was easy to miss in the flow of live television. He touched his collar briefly and kept talking. The segment kept going. Crew members watching the monitor noticed he looked slightly flushed, but the floor team held back, reading it as minor on-air discomfort. The control room continued the broadcast while querying the floor for status. This is the part that I find genuinely difficult. He touched his collar. He cleared his throat twice, and the people watching him on the monitor decided it was probably nothing. I understand why. In live television, hesitation costs you, but those seconds mattered. This is where things started to go bad. His face reddened. His speech became less fluid. His breathing began to change in a way that was no longer subtle. By the time the severity was clear to the people around him, the airway involvement was already significant. The segment was halted, and medical assistance was requested on set. A production assistant was sent to retrieve his epinephrine injector from the dressing room. The communication between the floor, the control room, and the dressing room added time that was not available to add. Emergency services were called, and basic first aid measures were attempted while waiting for their arrival. Paramedics arrived within several minutes. Braden had collapsed on set by the time they reached him. He was transported to hospital immediately, where medical teams worked to address the anaphylaxis and the airway compromise it had caused. Despite immediate intervention, Braden Lee went into cardiac arrest and died shortly after arriving at the hospital. The cause of death was recorded as severe anaphylaxis with airway compromise following ingestion of a known allergen. Investigators reviewing the incident found that the sesame oil had not been flagged as an allergen risk during segment preparation, that Braden's allergy had not been formally logged in any production or safety documentation, that his epinephrine injector had not been kept accessible during the broadcast, and that the recognition of anaphylaxis symptoms on set had been delayed by crew hesitation and communication lag. I just wonder how his fiancée felt when she heard the news of his death. So tragic.
It was June 9th, 2014, on the grounds of a community park in East London, England, where a local television crew was present to film a segment on community fundraising. The fair had drawn several hundred attendees under a flat, overcast sky, the kind of day that photographs gray and forgettable until it doesn't. Vesta Cairn was 25 and enrolled part-time in a theater studies program at a performing arts college in central London. She had been volunteering with the same fundraising collective since she was 19. Arriving before setup crews, staying through breakdown, noting what needed improvement for the following year. In the months before the event, she completed a short acrobatics course at a community fitness center, part of a longer effort to add physical performance to a skill set that already included stage movement and improv. When a TV producer announced they will have a segment for this fair, she had not been assigned to the dunk tank. She had put her own name on the list. I get the sense of someone trying to expand what they can do, stepping a little further each time, and it makes the decision feel personal in a way that's hard to detach from. Vesta had a history of vasovagal syncope, which can cause sudden fainting from stress or overstimulation. She disclosed this weeks earlier, and organizers cleared her with a colleague nearby. Despite considering restrictions, they allowed her in the tank due to her experience. No harness was used, the platform was 4 feet high, and the tank held approximately 4 feet of water, and no additional broadcast safety review was conducted despite the presence of live cameras. The tank was positioned on a flat concrete apron near the park's eastern fence. Around it, the environment was relentless, foam balls striking the target plate, the crowd cycling through anticipation and reaction, a loudspeaker from the main stage about 60 yards away running announcements on a loop. The segment was already live on the broadcast feed. Cohen, the TV organizer, was at the base of the platform when he noticed Vesta shift her weight and press one hand flat against the support post beside her seat. He moved closer. A second volunteer was already positioned on the access step to her left. The crowd had peaked. The noise was the loudest it had been all morning. This moment reads to me like the last chance for intervention, a small signal that something might be off, almost lost in everything else happening around it. The countdown from the crowd reached 1. A ball hit the target plate, captured cleanly by the broadcast camera. The platform released, the fall unfolding on the live broadcast as Vesta tilted forward, not backward as the drop should produce, but forward, her torso already without tension before the seat gave way. The colleague on the access step reached for her arm and missed. Cohen later told investigators the motion was unlike a fall, more like a switch being cut than a person losing balance. There was no corrective response from her body. Her head struck the exposed concrete edge beside the tank on the descent. Contact was at the right temple. Multiple witnesses described a single sharp crack that cut through the ambient noise and stopped the crowd within seconds. Her body continued forward and entered the water. Cohen and the second volunteer immediately pulled Vesta from the tank onto the flat concrete apron. Cohen positioned her supine and cleared her airway while the second volunteer initiated chest compressions. She convulsed once, a brief, involuntary contraction, then went still. A bystander near the barrier called emergency services, while several others stood frozen as the nearby monitor that had been relaying the live feed went to a studio segment. Paramedics arrived in approximately 6 minutes. Resuscitation efforts continued at the scene before being discontinued. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as severe blunt cranial trauma from direct impact to the right temporal region against a hard concrete edge. Findings included a basilar skull fracture, acute subdural hemorrhage, and structural damage to the right temporal lobe. No drowning was identified. The water was not a contributing factor. The collective posted a brief statement online 2 days later. Fundraising continued through the remainder of the season with minimal social media coverage and no publicly shared photographs or video from that day, and the broadcaster confirmed that the live segment had been cut immediately and would not be rebroadcast or released. A gathering at her performing arts college drew close friends and a few faculty members. No public ceremony was held beyond that. I have said this on this channel before, but the part that doesn't leave me is the paperwork trail, the disclosure, the review, the monitoring arrangement. Every safeguard that was supposed to be present was present. It still wasn't enough. That is harder to sit with than negligence. It doesn't point anywhere.
It was April 2019, and the early morning light was still soft over the city zoo as keepers began their routine behind the big cat enclosures. The facility had not yet opened to the public, and the service corridors were quiet, the air carrying the smell of feed and concrete. As the day settled in around the sounds of large animals moving through their morning, Noah Bennett was 24 years old and had been assigned to the Big Cat unit as a junior keeper. And I want to be clear about something before we go any further. This was not a reckless young man. He knew the rules. He was following them. He was not part of the broadcast being set up in the public viewing corridor that morning and had no role in the live segment. His assignment was specific, stationed at a designated gate control point inside a restricted service corridor. responsible for confirming gate alignment and visually verifying the animal's position during a routine shift transfer scheduled to run alongside the broadcast. He was in radio contact with the senior handler managing the sequence and was not expected to do anything beyond that. In the public viewing corridor, separated from the enclosures by reinforced glass and multiple containment barriers, the morning news crew had already set up and the camera was rolling. The reporter stood several feet back from the glass, conducting a live segment on zoo operations with a senior handler positioned safely on the opposite side of the barrier system. It was a controlled, unremarkable setup of the kind news crews run at zoo facilities regularly, with nothing visible to the camera suggesting anything unusual was happening behind the scenes. If I'm watching this, it will look like a normal and safe situation to me because there were no signs that anything was about to go wrong. The transfer sequence began during the broadcast. The senior handler initiated movement of the animal from one enclosure section into a connected holding corridor, a process that required each gate to be opened and secured in precise order, with every step verbally confirmed over radio before the next one began. And this is where everything started to come apart. A gate was reported as secured, but had not fully latched, and at the same moment the animal was encouraged forward into the transfer corridor. It entered the system earlier than expected, and because the secondary gate had not properly caught, it pushed through into the adjoining service corridor where Noah was stationed. The mistake was small, but it changed everything. One gate not fully closed was enough to break the system. Noah had no room to retreat. The corridor was narrow and enclosed, and the animal was already inside the space before the radio calls had finished crossing over each other. The lion came at him with the full force of its weight, taking him to the ground immediately. The impact alone was severe, several hundred pounds of muscle driving him into the concrete floor of the corridor. The animal's jaws closed around the back of his neck and upper shoulder, and the force of the bite was enough to cause catastrophic injury within seconds. What gets me about that is that all happened within seconds. There was no time to react or move away. Everything happened too fast for anyone to stop it. What followed was that staff outside the corridor worked frantically to engage the lockdown. On the live broadcast, the reporter faltered mid-sentence, turning toward the enclosure as the noise drew her attention, her reaction picking up faint shouts and urgent movement bleeding through her microphone from behind the restricted access doors. Off-camera staff moved quickly into frame, signaling to cut as the camera wavered and the crew was directed to clear the area without explanation. Zoo staff initiated emergency containment protocols immediately, locking down the transfer system and securing additional gates to restrict the animal's movement. An emergency code was called, and all non-essential personnel, including the news crew, were evacuated from the building. Noah Bennett was found unresponsive inside the service corridor once the animal was contained and was pronounced dead at the scene. The live broadcast had been cut. After the incident, the area was secured and staff were kept away while the situation was brought under control. A formal investigation determined the incident resulted from a procedural breakdown during gate confirmation compounded by miscommunication over radio. And the part that stays with me is that Noah did everything right. The system around him didn't. The zoo suspended all media access to animal handling areas pending a full review. A lot of you who watched my last video on workplace incidents kept asking me to cover cases where the environment itself was the danger. Not a person, not a machine, just the wrong place at the wrong moment. It was October 31st, 2016, in a coastal town in Massachusetts. A live Halloween broadcast was underway inside a restored 17th century house museum that operated as a seasonal tourist site. The program was produced by a local access television station using portable lighting, handheld cameras, and temporary cabling. The special featured a real-time paranormal-themed walkthrough designed to hold a continuous live feed as the host moved through different rooms of the building. Derek Sullivan, 34, was the on-air host of the special. He had spent years in local theater before moving into small-market television, where he became known for hosting holiday and event programming. His style leaned heavily on atmosphere and improvisation, rather than technical production. The Halloween episode was his most ambitious live project, built around an overnight investigation format with rotating guests and staged lighting effects. Station records described the production as low budget, with most equipment supplied by volunteers and short-term rentals rather than permanent studio gear. Preparation for the broadcast included a basic site walkthrough and limited safety review. The building's electrical system had been partially modernized, but several lower-level circuits remained tied to older wiring runs. Maintenance logs noted prior moisture intrusion after heavy rain earlier that month, especially in storage areas below ground level. Some outlets and junction points had been tagged for future repair, and at least one basement circuit cover plate was listed as missing, with a temporary barrier recommended until replacement. The television crew routed extension lines for lights and cameras through a rear access corridor and into the basement to reduce cable visibility on the main floors. The live program began shortly after 9 p.m. Derek moved room to room with a shoulder-mounted camera operator, while portable lights created high-contrast shadows for effect. Viewers watched as he demonstrated temperature meters and handheld sensors, while describing reported disturbances tied to the building's history. Minor lighting fluctuations occurred during the first hour, consistent with load changes from temporary production equipment. According to the later incident report, additional fixtures had been connected to an already stressed circuit shortly before the basement segment. Midway through the broadcast, Derek led the crew into the lower level, which was normally closed to the public and used for storage. The space had exposed beams, surface wiring, and a wall-mounted electrical panel with adjacent junction boxes. While attempting to darken and relight sections of the basement for visual effect, Derek reached toward what he believed was a lighting control switch near the panel. Instead, his hand contacted an uncovered metal junction box containing a live conductor splice tied to a temporary lighting tap. The contact created a direct fault path through his hand and forearm. Video showed an immediate muscular lock response followed by collapse. The camera remained live for several seconds as the operator stepped back, and the frame dropped toward the floor. The control room cut the feed once the loss of responsiveness was recognized. Crew members on site disconnected power at the main breaker and began first aid within minutes. Emergency services arrived shortly afterward and continued resuscitation attempts. Derek Sullivan was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical finding listed fatal electrical shock as the cause of death. The post-incident inspection documented multiple electrical hazards in the lower level, including an uncovered junction box containing a twisted conductor splice used for a temporary lighting tap, moisture exposure, overloaded temporary lighting circuits, and the absence of ground fault protection on the affected line. Local broadcast guidelines were later updated to require certified electrical clearance, restricted area barriers, and licensed electricians on site for all live remote productions in older structures. It was August 19, 2016, and the late afternoon heat pressed down on the county fairgrounds in southwestern Arizona. The rodeo arena sat under a cloudless sky, with temperatures hovering near 98 degrees. Dust hung in the still air as vendors prepared for the evening's main event. Bowen Fisk, a 35-year-old weekend sports correspondent for a regional television station, arrived early to set up for his live broadcast. Standing just over 6 feet tall with graying temples, Bowen had covered rodeos for nearly a decade. His background as an amateur bull rider gave him a comfort level around livestock that most reporters lacked. The assignment was straightforward: deliver a live introduction from inside the arena before the evening's competition began. Bowen positioned himself near the bucking chutes, where a massive Brahma bull waited in the steel enclosure. The animal weighed approximately 1,800 pounds and showed signs of agitation, shifting its weight and snorting as handlers prepared the rigging. Arena maintenance had been delayed that afternoon due to equipment issues. The gate latch on the chute showed visible stress marks and slight bending from previous use. Standard protocol required a secondary safety lock, but in the rush to prepare for the broadcast, this backup measure remained disengaged. Bowen stood roughly 6 feet from the chute gate, well within what he considered a safe distance. As the live feed began, Bowen started his introduction, gesturing toward the chutes behind him. The cameraman had positioned himself at ground level approximately 20 feet away, framing a medium shot with the chutes visible in the background. The bull continued to shift restlessly, pressing against the gate with increasing force. The primary latch, already compromised from wear, began to give way. Metal groaned softly under the strain. Without warning, the latch failed completely. The gate swung open with violent force, and the bull burst blindly out of the chute, veering across the arena as it tried to escape the enclosure. Bowen had no time to react as the animal's momentum carried it into his position. The bull's massive shoulder and head collided with Bowen's upper body, knocking him violently backward onto the hard-packed arena floor. His head struck the ground as the animal's weight followed him down. The bull stumbled over him in the momentum of its escape, driving a hoof into his chest before veering away toward the open arena. Bowen lay motionless where he had fallen as handlers rushed to regain control of the animal. The entire attack lasted approximately 4 seconds. Arena personnel immediately moved to contain the bull, while others rushed toward Bowen. The cameraman had captured the initial moments before instinctively lowering his equipment. Emergency medical personnel reached him within 90 seconds, but the injuries were catastrophic. Bowen was unconscious and unresponsive, with severe head trauma from the fall and crushing chest injuries from the trampling. He showed no detectable vital signs. He was pronounced dead at the scene from blunt force trauma and crushing injuries sustained in the collision. The subsequent investigation confirmed that the gate latch had failed due to metal fatigue and improper maintenance. The report noted the absence of the required secondary locking mechanism and cited inadequate safety protocols for media personnel. The live television feed captured the moment the bull struck Bowen and knocked him to the ground before the control room abruptly cut away. The footage showed Bowen being struck and knocked to the ground, but the camera angle shifted as the cameraman reacted to the unfolding tragedy. Fair officials immediately suspended all rodeo events pending a comprehensive safety review. It was December 31st, 2017, in Ilocos Sur, Philippines, near the old plaza where fireworks were set off every New Year's Eve. The streets followed a familiar rhythm of road closures, vendor stalls, and rehearsed countdowns. Around the square, aging houses with wooden balconies and concrete add-ons stood quietly above groups waiting for midnight. Paulo Rivera was 34, a sales coordinator for a regional construction supply distributor based in La Union. His job revolved around inventory tracking, delivery schedules, and keeping contractors satisfied before deadlines. He was single, routine-driven, and social only with a small circle of friends from work and college. That night, as a regional television station broadcast the city's New Year's Eve celebration live from the nearby plaza, Paulo joined friends at a house a few blocks away, an old 3-story structure inherited decades earlier and lightly renovated over time. The house belonged to a friend whose family had lived near the plaza since the 1970s. Like many old homes in the area, it had been expanded upward without modern reinforcement. The third-floor balcony was a narrow concrete extension, added years earlier for festival viewing. It was never designed to hold more than a few people at once. Paulo brought drinks, joked easily, and stayed near the railing to watch fireworks without forcing his way through the crowd below. As the evening went on, more friends arrived. Music played, and people drifted toward the balcony to get a clear view of the plaza, the same stretch of street where a regional television station had positioned a fixed wide-angle camera at the edge of the plaza, framing the crowd, fireworks launch area, and the row of older houses behind them for the live countdown. Fireworks were already being staged, lighting the street in brief flashes. By 11:45 p.m., as everyone anticipated the fireworks display, the balcony held more people than it was meant to support. As several people leaned forward together to see the first fireworks ignite, weight shifted toward the outer edge. Fine cracks near the base went unnoticed, hidden by layers of paint and shadow. At 11:59 p.m., as the live broadcast counted down the final seconds of the year, fireworks ignited above the plaza. The camera held its wide shot. In the background, just above the crowd line, the third-floor balcony shifted. A visible crack ran across the slab, and within seconds, the outer edge dropped. The collapse unfolded fully within the frame as the concrete tore away from the wall. 3 figures were carried down with the falling slab. Paulo struck a lower awning, rotated, and hit the pavement head first. The 2 others fell at a shallower angle, striking the ground feet first and absorbing the impact through their lower limbs. The camera remained live for several seconds as people scattered beneath the falling debris, before the feed abruptly cut away. Emergency services were called immediately. Police and medics arrived within minutes. Paulo showed no signs of life, blood mixed with broken concrete and firework debris along the roadside, as authorities secured the area and halted the celebration below. The two other individuals were found alive but critically injured and were transported to a nearby hospital. The medical examiner later reported that Paulo died from catastrophic head and neck trauma. The injuries were immediately fatal, with no chance of consciousness after impact. Toxicology tests were negative. Shortly after midnight, the regional television broadcast returned live, no longer focused on fireworks, but on flashing lights, cordoned streets, and officials redirecting crowds. The house was declared unsafe and partially demolished weeks later. City officials ordered inspections of nearby old structures around the plaza.
It was April 18, 2018, at a restored Victorian estate in rural Virginia. The main hall had been prepared for a live auction broadcast. Rows of seated bidders facing a central podium, camera equipment positioned around the room, and additional lighting rigs brought in to give the broadcast the visual quality the venue deserved. Eleanor Price was 54 years old and had spent most of her career working in regional auction houses across the country. She was knowledgeable, composed on camera, and had been building toward exactly this kind of assignment for years. A live broadcast heritage property auction from a historic estate was the kind of assignment that could define a career. She had described it that way to colleagues in the weeks leading up to the event. That evening, she stood at the podium in the center of the hall and opened the broadcast. When I read that she had described this assignment as the kind that could define a career, I had to put this down for a moment. The hall was everything the auction house had promised: original Victorian interiors, restored surfaces, and at the center of the ceiling, directly above the podium, a large multi-arm crystal chandelier that had hung in the same position for over a century. Nobody had thought to question it. That is not unusual. Things that have always been there tend to stop being seen. The production team had mounted an overhead camera rig along the ceiling that week. It was motorized, built to make slow tracking movements across the auction floor during the broadcast. During setup, they tested it for picture quality. It performed well. The rig hummed quietly when it moved, a low, continuous sound that blended into the noise of the room being prepared around it. The auction opened and bidding moved through the early lots at a steady pace. Eleanor worked the room with the ease of someone who had done this for decades. Above her, the camera moved slowly, steadily, the way it had been designed to. After several lots, a faint creaking became audible from the ceiling above the podium. Dust shifted slightly from the beams. Neither was recognized as a warning by anyone on the floor. The mounting point gave way. Shortly after, the chandelier dropped vertically as the anchor point failed, releasing the chain and sending the full weight of the fixture down without deflection onto the podium where Eleanor was standing. The impact crushed the podium structure and drove Eleanor to the floor beneath it. She did not move after the impact. The broadcast feed cut within seconds. Attendees in the hall reacted immediately, and staff moved toward the podium through the debris. Emergency services were contacted immediately, and paramedics arrived within approximately 8 minutes. Eleanor Price was confirmed dead before she could be transported. Investigators found localized dry rot concentrated around the anchor penetration point in the ceiling timber. The mounting structure had already been significantly weakened before the event was staged. The motorized camera rig, mounted along the same joist span, had transmitted continuous vibration through the shared load-bearing members directly into the chandelier anchor. The timber could not hold under the repeated stress. No structural assessment of the suspended fixtures had ever been carried out. No one had asked for one. The creaking, the dust, those were the warnings, and nobody in that room understood them for what they were. I am not sure I would have either. That is the honest answer.
It was March 15, 2018, and a severe convective system had been tightening over Greater São Paulo since late morning. By early afternoon, the hill where Aldrich Mendes would stand held a view of the whole approaching system, and from inside the broadcast station 4 miles away, that view was the point. Aldrich was 29 years old and had spent 4 years as a field meteorology correspondent for a regional broadcast station in São Paulo. His reputation among colleagues was specific: meticulous with preparation, reckless with exposure. He reviewed radar loops before every assignment, taped his microphone connections personally, and kept a laminated wind speed reference card in his jacket pocket. He was also known for treating safety advisories as negotiable when the story was worth it. 6 months earlier, he had completed an annual lightning safety refresher covering exposure reduction, elevated position avoidance, and minimum crew distance from metal equipment during active lightning. He signed the acknowledgement form. That morning, producers urged an outdoor live segment to maximize viewership during the storm's peak window. Aldrich chose a small hill on the city's outskirts, roughly 20 feet above the surrounding terrain, and by 2:40 p.m. was standing on it holding a metal core microphone. Live cable running across wet grass toward Theo, his cameraman, 30 feet back. It's like watching someone knowingly step into a checklist of hazards. Thunder was cycling every 9 seconds by 2:47 p.m. Wind gusts had reached 35 miles per hour. A single small grounding rod had been set near the broadcast position, but it did not create a safe zone around Aldrich. He was within 4 feet of it, too close for any real protection. He was mid-segment, live on the broadcast feed, when a ground flash struck a chain-link fence 60 feet below at the hill's base, sending lateral current through the saturated soil and nearby wet grass, which reached the live cable running up the hillside. I find it difficult to move through this story without thinking about how many people in that production chain had the authority to pull him off that hill and chose not to. The current entered through the wet cable at the microphone connector. Theo saw the microphone jump violently in Aldrich's grip, a single rigid vibration, before sparks jumped from the cable connector at his feet. The physicality of this moment is what makes it so jarring for me. It's not gradual, not something that escalates, just one instant where everything changes with no chance to react. Muscles in Aldrich's body contracted uncontrollably from the current. His back arched hard, his right arm extended outward at an angle that was not voluntary. He cleared the ground by several inches before dropping onto his left side in the wet grass. His jacket was smoking at the collar and along the right forearm seam. The grip tape on the microphone handle had burned through at both contact points. Theo dropped the camera and ran toward him as the surge and Aldrich's collapse remained visible on the live broadcast for a brief moment before the feed cut. As he reached Aldrich, Theo felt a brief, sharp shock through the camera body from the voltage spike traveling in the cable, which caused his hands to tingle. He managed to drag Aldrich 3 feet before stopping, unable to continue. The burn marks in the grass were irregular, consistent with the chaotic path of a conduction-mediated lightning strike rather than a straight line. His right shoe had partially separated at the sole, consistent with the exit burn at the left heel documented later by the medical examiner. He did not move again. A pedestrian on the road below called emergency services within 30 seconds of the strike. A second bystander joined the call. Paramedics arrived approximately 10 minutes later and initiated resuscitation at the scene. Aldrich was pronounced dead at 3:14 p.m. The medical examiner determined cause of death to be cardiac arrest secondary to an indirect lightning strike conducted through wet equipment and soil. Entry burns were noted at the right hand, exit burns at the left heel. Cardiac tissue showed non-specific signs of electrothermal damage. No blunt trauma injuries were identified. The exposure was classified as conduction-mediated rather than direct strike. The station aired a brief statement that evening. Journalists struck during storm coverage and pulled the broadcast footage from its archive without public explanation. Colleagues left flowers at the hilltop the following morning. Staff were offered counseling sessions quietly, without announcement. I personally think that this wasn't a freak accident. It was a decision made inside an air-conditioned building by people watching the same radar Aldrich tracked for a living, who sent him up a hill anyway.
It was March 2014 in the ballroom of a downtown Chicago hotel. Around 95 guests were seated at round tables facing a temporary stage with tight theatrical lighting. The event had been selected as a feature segment for a local cable show that covered entertainment events across the city. Lena Voss was 34 years old and had worked as a professional magician's assistant long enough that positioning herself inside mechanical stage apparatus was as routine to her as any other part of the job. She understood the equipment, understood what exact alignment inside it required, and trusted both the machinery and the operator controlling it the way you have to, when the act depends on both working perfectly at the same time. And that word, trust, is the one that keeps coming back to me with this story. However, people who worked with her said she was careful and precise, someone who followed each step the same way every time. She was used to working inside tight spaces and relied on the equipment to function as expected. Guests were seated and watching quietly, focused on the stage as the show moved from one act to the next. The illusion that evening involved a horizontal cabinet fitted with a motorized sliding tray system. The tray was designed to retract her body laterally away from the path of a descending circular saw blade at the critical moment of the performance, creating the illusion of the blade passing through her while she had already been moved clear of its path. Backstage, she prepared as usual, calm and familiar with every step of the sequence. She entered the apparatus, positioned herself flat along the tray, held the required posture, and waited for the performance to begin. Compared to every other incident I talk about, this one stands out. There were no warning signs before the act started. The equipment appeared to be working the same way it always had. The act opened as rehearsed, with lighting and music timed to mask the mechanical movement inside the cabinet and hold the audience's attention on the exterior of the apparatus. At the critical moment, the tray was triggered to retract along its track, and this is where everything that was supposed to protect her quietly stopped working. A worn drive gear in the tray's motor assembly slipped under load, causing the tray to stall short of its full travel distance and leaving part of Lena's body outside the safe clearance zone the retraction was designed to create. The movement stopped just short of where it needed to be. The difference was small, but it was enough to leave her in danger. From the operator's position, stage lighting glare, the angle of the enclosure, and the cabinet housing obscuring the lower alignment line made the misalignment appear minor, consistent with what he had previously seen as acceptable alignment during rehearsals. What gets me is that he genuinely could not tell. The system gave him nothing. There was no position sensor confirming full retraction and no interlock preventing blade activation unless the tray reached its end position. Then the operator triggered the saw's descent on cue, and the rotating blade made contact with Lena's midsection, cutting through tissue and causing immediate and severe abdominal injury. The cabinet concealed the full extent of what was happening from the audience for only a moment before the performance broke down visibly. The sound and the sudden halt of the act making clear to everyone in the room that something had gone wrong. The live broadcast captured it in full before anyone could cut the feed. I have read a lot of these cases, and this is majorly disturbing. I wonder how the audience slept that night. The performance halted immediately as the deviation became visible and stage crew moved in from both sides. At first, some people in the audience were unsure what they were seeing. Then it became clear that something had gone seriously wrong. Emergency services were called, and Lena was removed from the apparatus and transported to a nearby hospital where she underwent emergency surgery. She died approximately 4 hours later. Investigators found the accident resulted from a worn drive gear slipping under load within the sliding tray system, compounded by the absence of a position sensor confirming full retraction and no interlock preventing blade activation unless the tray reached its end position. And the part I find disturbing was how entirely preventable it was. One sensor, one interlock. Lena Voss would have gone home. She was just 34 years old. The failure came from more than one problem, but each one could have been prevented. Small safety checks could have stopped the sequence before it reached that point. I actually spent 3 hours going back through stage illusion accident records trying to find a comparable case, and I couldn't find one that documented this clearly. What a tragic way to die. It was May 22, 2018, in the Phoenix metro area. A live evening broadcast was underway inside a small community college television studio, where a student-produced talk show focused on local civic issues and investigative reporting. The set was built in a converted media classroom with fixed cameras, overhead lights, and a live switcher feeding directly to a regional cable access channel. The episode's featured guest was an independent journalist scheduled to discuss a recent investigation into municipal contracting irregularities. Sarah Kim, 28, worked as a freelance investigative reporter covering local procurement and zoning disputes. Over 5 years, she had published several documented reports involving bid favoritism and shell subcontractors tied to mid-level officials and private developers. Her work had drawn legal threats and hostile messages, but no confirmed direct attacks. The live studio appearance was arranged to summarize her findings and explain how public records requests were used in her reporting process. Production notes described the episode as higher interest than usual, but not classified as high security risk. The studio operated with a small crew of students and one faculty supervisor. Standard procedure required exterior doors to remain locked during live broadcasts, with entry routed through a monitored front desk. A secondary side corridor door near the studio was normally alarmed, but had been set to maintenance mode earlier that afternoon for equipment deliveries, and the door was physically wedged open for repeated load-in trips. The alert had not been rearmed before airtime. Interior hallway cameras were present, but not actively monitored during the show because the control station was focused on switching the live program feed. The interview began shortly after 7:30 p.m. and proceeded normally through the first segment. Sarah discussed document trails, contract layering, and oversight gaps, while the host reviewed graphics prepared by the student staff. Approximately 20 minutes into the live broadcast, a man entered through the side corridor door and walked toward the studio floor. Video later reviewed from the hallway camera showed he wore a delivery vest and carried a small tool bag, which matched the type commonly seen during earlier equipment drop-offs that day. The individual stepped onto the set edge within camera frame while the segment was still live. Crew members initially interpreted the approach as a late technical adjustment because maintenance staff had moved through the area earlier. The man closed distance to the guest position and produced a concealed handgun at close range. The live camera feed captured the immediate confrontation and Sarah's collapse after a single shot. The director cut to a standby graphic within seconds, as audio was muted and the studio feed was terminated. Campus security and city police units arrived within minutes and secured the building. Paramedics confirmed Sarah Kim was dead at the scene from a gunshot wound. The suspect, later identified as Daniel Ruiz, 41, was located that night during a traffic stop and taken into custody without further incident. Court records show he was charged with first-degree murder and illegal firearm possession, later convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Investigators found no organized crime links and concluded the motive was a personal grievance tied to a company named in one of Kim's published investigations. The official review cited multiple security failures, including a disabled side door alarm and no dedicated access monitor during the live broadcast. Updated campus broadcast rules later required verified alarm status, controlled entry staffing, and a designated floor safety marshal for all live shows. It was October 28, 2016, at a mid-sized college football stadium in the Midwest. The autumn air carried a crisp 52-degree chill as thousands of fans filled the concrete stands under overcast skies. The facility buzzed with the energy of homecoming weekend, its artificial turf gleaming under the stadium lights that had just flickered on against the darkening evening. 22-year-old Zora worked part-time in stadium operations while pursuing her communications degree. Known for her reliability and quick thinking, she had been handling game day logistics for 2 seasons. Her supervisor described her as someone who never hesitated to jump in when needed, always maintaining a calm demeanor even during the chaos of major sporting events. That evening, Zora was assigned to the utility crew, responsible for transporting supplies and equipment during game breaks. The stadium employed a sophisticated cable camera system that ran on tensioned wires stretched diagonally across the field, allowing for dynamic aerial shots during broadcasts. The system operated at high speeds, with cameras that could accelerate rapidly between predetermined positions. During the third quarter timeout, Zora received instructions to deliver water bottles to the visiting team's sideline. The break in play typically lasted 3 minutes, providing a narrow window for field access. Stadium protocol required coordination between broadcast operations and field personnel, but the communication system relied heavily on visual cues and radio chatter. As Zora stepped onto the field carrying the supply crate, the cable camera system initiated a rapid transition sequence. The camera carriage, weighing approximately 15 pounds and traveling at an estimated 25 miles per hour, moved along its predetermined path. The tensioned cable, positioned roughly 12 feet above the turf at its lowest point, was designed to remain clear of normal field activity. The collision occurred near the 35-yard line. The high-speed camera carriage struck Zora across the upper body with tremendous force, knocking her violently backward onto the artificial turf. She hit the ground hard, lying motionless as the moving carriage dragged past her before the operator triggered an emergency stop and the system ground to a halt. The impact left her unconscious and unresponsive on the turf, with visible head and neck injuries. Players from both teams immediately signaled for medical attention, as the live broadcast briefly captured the moment she was struck and collapsed before the feed quickly cut away and stadium personnel rushed to the scene. Emergency medical technicians reached her within 90 seconds, finding her unconscious and barely breathing. They began life support and transported her to the regional trauma center within 12 minutes. The game was suspended as investigators documented the scene. The cable camera system was immediately shut down and secured as evidence. Despite aggressive intervention, Zora never regained consciousness. She was pronounced dead at the hospital 4 hours after the incident from complications of severe spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury. The investigation concluded that the incident resulted from a breakdown in communication protocols between broadcast operations and field management. No comprehensive field clearance procedure existed for coordinating cable camera movements with personnel access. The tensioned cable system, while properly maintained and functioning as designed, operated without adequate safety measures. The stadium implemented new safety protocols requiring complete camera system shutdown during any field access and installed additional communication equipment. The investigation found no mechanical malfunction, determining that the tragedy stemmed from procedural gaps in managing the intersection of broadcast technology and human activity in the live sports environment. It was August 19, 2018, in Evansville, Indiana, outside a mid-size riverfront park, where a regional music station hosted a free summer concert broadcast live on local television. The evening was warm and humid, with temporary fencing, vendor tents, and narrow entry lanes funneling thousands of people toward a single stage as daylight faded. Linda Carver was 58 and worked as a payroll clerk for a manufacturing supplier on the city's east side. She had held the same job for nearly 20 years, known for steady attendance and quiet reliability. Linda lived alone after her divorce and spent weekends visiting her grandchildren or watching local broadcasts she recognized by name. She rarely went to concerts, but the station promoting the event was one she listened to at work, and the headlining act played music she recognized from the radio. The show advertised open access, no tickets required, and a family-friendly crowd. The event was produced on a limited budget. Security staffing was contracted locally, and the layout relied on temporary barriers installed that morning. The stage sat at the end of a sloped lawn, with fencing guiding foot traffic through two main entrances. The broadcast crew focused on the stage and crowd energy, not the perimeter. Attendance exceeded early estimates by several thousand. By sunset, the area near the front was packed shoulder to shoulder, with little space to move once people stopped. Linda arrived shortly after 7 p.m. with her sister. They stood near the back at first, then edged forward as the opening act finished. The ground sloped downward toward the stage, and people leaned to see over others' shoulders. Weather alerts earlier in the day warned of possible thunderstorms, but the sky stayed clear. As the headliner prepared to come on, the station's live broadcast returned from commercial and showed a wide shot of the crowd pressing closer. Shortly after 9 p.m., movement started near one of the entrances. A surge rippled forward when people tried to push in from behind, believing the gates were about to close. The fencing flexed. Security personnel attempted to redirect the people, but the crowd noise drowned out their instructions. The slope caused bodies to tilt forward, transferring weight downhill. The pressure built unevenly, faster than anyone could step away from it. The surge reached the center in seconds. People stumbled. When one person fell, others tripped over them. Linda went down near the edge of a vendor tent where the ground dipped slightly. She was knocked onto her side and pinned as more bodies pressed over her. Feet and legs struck her back and shoulders. She could not stand because there was no space to push up. The pressure across her chest increased as people continued to fall forward. The live television broadcast cut from the stage to a wide crowd shot as the music stopped abruptly. The camera captured people waving for help and trying to pull others up. Linda was no longer visible beneath the mass of bodies. Emergency services were called immediately. As security opened a breach in the fencing to relieve pressure, the crowd slowly loosened as people were pushed backward. When responders reached Linda, she was unresponsive. She was removed from the crowd and transported by ambulance within minutes. Several others were treated on site for injuries. The broadcast remained live as anchors acknowledged a serious incident and urged viewers to avoid speculation while emergency lights filled the frame. Linda was pronounced dead at the hospital. The medical examiner later reported the cause of death as traumatic asphyxia. Her chest had been compressed for several minutes, preventing her lungs from expanding. Rib fractures and bruising were present, but there were no defensive injuries and no signs of intoxication. The findings were consistent with a crowd crush on a sloped surface. City officials suspended future large events at the park, pending review. The station ended the broadcast early and did not rebroadcast the concert footage. Linda's family declined interviews and held a small service attended by co-workers and relatives. Each year after, the station adjusted its summer programming, but the live shot of the crowd pulling apart that night still circulates online, marking the moment the concert stopped and never resumed.
It was September 9th, 2019, at an indoor arena hosting a regional kennel club show in Cincinnati, Ohio. Multiple rings were active across the floor, handlers moving their dogs through judging passes while the audience sat close to the action. Broadcast cameras moved between rings, and a commentary team covered each breed category from ringside positions. Graham Wells was 39 years old and had been doing ringside commentary for 6 years. He was comfortable in the environment, good at reading a room, and the kind of broadcaster who made the work look effortless. His job was to describe what was happening in the ring for viewers at home, keep the energy up between judging phases, and occasionally interact with handlers during breaks. He was also the kind of person who did more than the minimum. Colleagues had mentioned it. He had a habit of getting close to the action because he believed the audience deserved to feel like they were there. The Belgian Malinois in the ring that morning was a high-drive working dog from working line stock, known for its speed, focus, and sensitivity to sudden movement. Show conditioning allows these dogs to perform in public settings, but their reactions can still be sharp under certain conditions. The handler was experienced, and the dog was under control. The ring was separated from the commentary area by a low rope boundary, with a small buffer space typically kept clear between handlers and media. Graham stepped slightly closer to the boundary during the coverage as the handler brought the dog near the edge following a judging pass. It was the kind of move he had made dozens of times before. The dog was alert and focused. A nearby camera shifted position abruptly, creating a sudden movement in the dog's peripheral vision. The dog's attention shifted immediately. Graham, still on air and maintaining his commentary, reached forward into the dog's space toward its head without a cue from the handler. The dog reacted to the combined stimulus of the sudden movement and the reach into its space. The sudden bite and his reaction to it pulled Graham off balance. His footing shifted at the boundary between the ring mat and the exposed hard floor, and he went down at the edge of the ring. The handler moved to regain control immediately, but the initial bite and pull sequence had completed before additional control could be fully applied. Graham collapsed at ringside. The fall drove a severe impact into his head and upper body as he hit the hard floor at the edge of the ring. On the broadcast, the audio broke and the camera shifted away from the ring within seconds. The audience near the ring reacted as staff moved in immediately. Medical staff were on the floor and reached him within seconds. The bite had caused significant soft tissue injury to his hand and forearm. The fall itself drove the primary trauma, a severe impact to his head and upper body against the hard floor at the ring boundary. Emergency services were contacted and paramedics arrived within minutes. Despite immediate response and sustained effort, Graham Wells was pronounced dead at the arena. The cause of death was recorded as fatal traumatic head and upper body injury following a fall precipitated by an animal bite. The bite initiated the loss of balance. The floor did the rest. The review found that only a low rope separated the commentary area from the ring, that Graham had stepped into the buffer zone and reached toward the dog without a handler cue, and that a sudden stimulus triggered the reaction. Graham had done this for years. He knew those rings. But in one moment, one reach without a cue, the situation changed completely and permanently. Experience is not the same as immunity. That is the sentence I would write under every single case in this video if I could.
It was December 23, 2015, in a paved public square in central Cairo, Egypt. The afternoon sun flat and pale gold, the air carrying exhaust and roasted nuts, and where a man who had spent nearly a decade perfecting his craft bled out on a concrete stage in front of a live crowd in under 2 minutes. Radi Mansour was 31 years old and had worked as a street performer in Cairo since his early 20s, building a quiet but reliable reputation in the tourist corridors near the city's most visited landmarks. He specialized in bladed juggling, knives, cleavers, and most prominently, machetes, and had spent years refining a routine built around precise arc throws and timed catch sequences. I keep thinking how this isn't some reckless beginner. This is someone who practiced every day, which somehow makes what's coming feel worse. Local vendors who watched him regularly described him as obsessively consistent. He ran his full routine every morning before tourists arrived, adjusting spacing and timing until each pass was repeatable to the inch. He had performed at street festivals, private events, and cultural exhibitions across the city. What he had never done was perform under live broadcast conditions. 3 weeks before December 23rd, a regional production crew approached him about a short live segment for a local station's holiday coverage. The arrangement was simple: perform his standard routine, draw a crowd. One detail changed in the final production meeting. The low rope barrier he used to keep bystanders at a safe distance was not removed, but was instead repositioned about 6 feet back and slightly lowered to improve camera sightlines, which slightly reduced the protective space around him. The square that afternoon held roughly 60 tourists and local pedestrians in a loose semicircle around the performance area. A 40-foot stretch of uneven concrete slightly sloped toward a center drain. The surface had been patched several times over the years, and a raised seam ran across the stone roughly 4 feet from where Radi typically planted his left foot during catch sequences. The routine started cleanly with the main broadcast camera fixed on him. Witnesses described the first several passes as controlled and precise. On the fourth sequence, Radi shifted slightly to his right. His left heel caught the concrete seam, a minor slip that displaced him only an inch or two from his normal stance. The machete left his right hand on its upward arc. This small stance change altered the blade's trajectory enough that it came back lower and closer than he expected. Radi extended his left arm to correct. His right hand crossed to intercept. The crew shouted from behind the camera cluster. He did not have time to redirect. I'm literally watching this like it's in slow motion, knowing it's just inches and seconds, deciding everything is honestly terrifying. The blade struck the right side of his neck at the base, just above the clavicle, the moment visible on the live broadcast for several seconds before the feed cut. It opened a deep wound approximately 4 inches across the side of the neck, severing the right external jugular vein and lacerating the right common carotid artery. He dropped straight to the pavement. No stagger, no catch. Blood reached the concrete in volume within seconds and spread across the uneven surface faster than anyone around him could process. It's so direct and clinical, but that almost makes it worse for me because there's no drama, just instant reality. A witness named Samir, standing near the front of the crowd, moved first. He pushed through the bystanders and pressed both hands against the wound. Tourists pulled back, several screaming. The production crew cut the live feed within approximately 20 seconds of the fall. Samir held pressure while someone called for an ambulance. A crew member placed the emergency call. Responders arrived 9 minutes later. He was transported to a regional medical facility and pronounced dead on arrival. The coroner's finding, in plain terms, acute hemorrhagic shock caused by laceration of the right carotid artery and jugular vein. Given the severity and location of the wound, there was no viable intervention window. Death resulted directly from exsanguination. The local station issued a brief line noting a performance accident. No extended coverage followed. Samir gave one account to investigators and declined to speak further. Radi's family held a private funeral attended only by close relatives and a small number of fellow performers. Multiple tourists had recorded portions of the incident on their phones, but most footage remained private or unshared outside immediate circles. The production crew issued no public statement.
It was May 2016 in Los Angeles, California. Studio lights inside a primetime variety stage were running at full intensity as the evening's program built toward its most anticipated segment of the night. Adrian Cole was 32 years old and had built his career around high-risk aerial work, the kind of live performance that requires absolute precision from every person involved in the setup. He had performed controlled vertical drops before, understood the rigging, and trusted the system. Crew members later described him as disciplined during setup, someone who relied on proper rigging checks and expected redundancy systems to function exactly as designed. That evening, the segment involved a controlled vertical drop from an elevated platform above the stage, using a descender device connected to an overhead anchor rig to regulate his speed and bring him to a stop at a predetermined height above the floor. A secondary safety line was part of the planned configuration. Adrian was fitted into the harness, checked by the rigging crew, and lifted into position above the stage as the host introduced the act. The rigging assembly above him consisted of a primary anchor point with load-bearing connectors distributing force through the descender system, with the safety line intended to act as an independent arrest system if the primary failed. And look, from where the audience was sitting, everything looked exactly as it should. The stunt began on cue. Adrian stepped off the platform and the descender engaged, pulling tension through the line as he dropped. And this is where things went wrong. A primary load-bearing carabiner within the rigging assembly failed under load, the connector having been unintentionally cross-loaded, placing force across its weaker axis, where its strength was significantly reduced. Under the sudden load of the drop, the cross-loaded carabiner failed, giving way as force was applied across its weaker axis. The descender itself remained intact, but with the anchor point gone, it had nothing to regulate against. The system lost all tension instantly. With no resistance applied through the descender, the line provided no braking force, converting the controlled drop into an uncontrolled fall. The secondary safety line, which should have arrested the fall, had been clipped to the same overhead anchor rather than an independent point, meaning both lines failed together when the anchor point gave way. That detail is the one that stays with me. One decision during setup, and the backup became useless. Adrian dropped the remaining distance to the stage without deceleration and impacted the floor at a speed the landing was never designed to absorb. The force of impact exceeded the tolerance of the intended landing system, which had been configured for a controlled descent rather than a full freefall. The host's expression changed. Crew members were already moving from the wings, and the feed cut away within seconds. The stage was cleared and emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics attended to Adrian on site before he was transported to a nearby hospital. Despite medical intervention, he did not survive. Adrian Cole was pronounced dead that evening from injuries sustained during the fall, including severe blunt force trauma consistent with a high-impact landing. Investigators examining the rigging identified the cross-loaded carabiner as the primary failure point, compounded by the secondary safety line having been anchored to the same connection rather than an independent overhead point, rendering the redundancy system ineffective at the moment it was needed. The incident was ultimately classified as a rigging failure involving improper connector loading and a non-independent safety system configuration. And the part I find hardest to move past is that the backup existed. It was there, but because it was tied into the same system, it was never going to stop the fall if the primary failed. I've covered rigging failures before. If you haven't seen that video, I'll link it. But what happened to Evan Cole sits in a completely different category. It was December 14th, 2017, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. A live early morning television segment was underway in the outdoor lot of a regional news station, where a winter survival demonstration had been set up for continuous broadcast coverage. Portable shelters, heaters, and weather instruments were arranged behind the presenter to compare different cold weather protection methods under real conditions. Air temperature measured -18 degrees Fahrenheit, with sustained wind producing wind chills near -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Jennifer Walsh, 32, was a field reporter assigned to the station's public safety and weather features. She had several years of experience reporting in severe winter conditions and had completed certified cold weather safety training courses. Producers approved the segment as an educational demonstration, showing how layering systems, wind barriers, and emergency shelters function in extreme cold. The original safety plan called for rotating on-air exposure in short intervals, with scheduled warm-up breaks inside a heated vehicle between segments. Pre-show planning notes outlined strict limits, no more than 15 minutes of continuous exposure per cycle, and mandatory medical check-ins after each return indoors. However, the live format combined multiple scheduled hits into a single extended block due to programming delays earlier that morning. Instead of rotating out, Jennifer remained outside to maintain visual continuity, while the cameraman and audio technician rotated through warming periods. On-site medics monitored from a nearby vehicle and tracked visible indicators rather than continuous core temperature readings. The demonstration began shortly after 6 a.m., with Jennifer wearing insulated boots, layered thermal clothing, and a wind-resistant outer shell. She first showed how different glove types affected dexterity, then compared open exposure versus standing behind a portable windscreen. During the second hour, light snow began blowing across the lot, and wind gusts increased. Review findings later noted that her outer shell zipper had been partially open at the collar to accommodate a microphone cable, allowing repeated wind entry at the neck seal. Perspiration from repeated movement between props also dampened her inner base layer, reducing insulation efficiency. As exposure time accumulated beyond the original rotation limits, Jennifer's movements slowed and her hand coordination worsened. According to the medic log, she missed 2 scheduled warm-up breaks while continuing demonstrations of emergency blanket use and vehicle kits. Early hypothermia signs, reduced dexterity, and delayed responses were interpreted by crew as normal cold reaction for the segment's purpose. The live camera feed showed increasing speech slurring and shortened step length as she transitioned between stations. Near the end of the third hour on air, she attempted to reposition a wind barrier and stumbled. The live broadcast camera captured her losing balance and collapsing onto the packed snow surface. The control room immediately cut back to the studio, while field staff and medics reached her within moments. Passive and active rewarming measures were started on site, followed by rapid transport to a hospital. Walsh was pronounced dead later that day. The medical report listed severe accidental hypothermia with cardiac arrhythmia as the cause of death. The station's incident review concluded that extended continuous exposure beyond the planned rotation limits, wind intrusion at the collar opening, and moisture-degraded base layers combined to accelerate heat loss. Updated field broadcast protocols afterward required enforced exposure timers, mandatory rotation regardless of live scheduling changes, and continuous temperature monitoring for extreme cold demonstrations. It was February 3, 2017, when a winter storm began building strength along the northeastern coastline. The city's skyline disappeared behind sheets of driving snow as temperatures plummeted below freezing. Ice formed rapidly on exposed surfaces, creating treacherous conditions across the metropolitan area. Wind gusts reached 35 miles per hour, turning the already dangerous storm into a significant weather event that demanded immediate coverage. Lyra Gant, a 31-year-old weekend weather presenter, had transitioned into broadcast journalism after spending several years as a high school science teacher. Her methodical approach to explaining complex weather patterns made her popular with viewers, though she remained relatively new to live outdoor reporting. Known for her thorough preparation and calm demeanor under pressure, she had quickly earned respect among colleagues despite her limited field experience. The station assigned her to provide visual storm coverage from a 14-story rooftop downtown, chosen specifically for its unobstructed view of the approaching weather system. The building's rooftop presented immediate challenges that morning. Ice patches had formed near the concrete parapet during the overnight hours, creating slick surfaces that reflected the gray morning light. The crew fastened Lyra's safety harness to what appeared to be a secure rooftop anchor point, but the mounting had deteriorated over time without proper inspection. Her regular footwear lacked specialized traction aids, a detail that seemed minor given the rushed nature of the assignment. The building's maintenance staff had not applied ice-melting compounds to the rooftop surface. Weather conditions deteriorated faster than meteorologists had predicted. What began as steady snowfall quickly intensified, pushing toward whiteout conditions. Visibility dropped significantly as the storm's core approached the metropolitan area. The camera operator positioned the equipment for a wide shot that would capture both Lyra and the dramatic storm backdrop, maintaining a fixed angle throughout the broadcast segment. As Lyra delivered her weather update, she stepped backward to gesture toward the approaching storm front, her movement still framed in the live shot as the camera held its wide angle. Her boot made contact with a patch of black ice that had formed along the rooftop's edge. The smooth sole found no purchase on the frozen surface. Simultaneously, a powerful gust of wind struck the exposed rooftop, creating additional instability as she fought to regain her footing. Her body went over the parapet backward. The safety harness snapped tight, loading the corroded anchor bolt with sudden force. The mounting plate tore partially out of the concrete before ripping free completely. The 14-story fall took approximately 3 seconds. Her body struck a fabric awning over a restaurant entrance partway down, tearing it instantly from its brackets before continuing uninterrupted to the concrete sidewalk below, where she impacted headfirst. Pedestrians on the street below scattered immediately after witnessing the fall. Emergency responders arrived within 6 minutes of the initial call, but the massive trauma from the impact had caused instantaneous death. The medical examiner later confirmed catastrophic cranial and thoracic injuries consistent with a fall from that height. The investigation revealed that the rooftop anchor point had failed its last inspection, but had not been replaced. Building management confirmed that ice conditions had not been assessed prior to the broadcast setup. The station immediately suspended all rooftop weather coverage, pending a comprehensive safety review. Federal workplace safety investigators cited multiple protocol violations in their final report, including inadequate equipment inspection procedures and failure to properly assess weather conditions before proceeding. The live broadcast briefly captured Lyra slipping and disappearing backward from the frame before the control room abruptly cut the feed. Storm coverage ended without explanation, leaving viewers unaware of what had occurred until official statements were released hours later. It was September 6, 2018, on a downhill highway outside San Fernando City, Pampanga, where a regional TV station aired a live traffic report. As vehicles slowed near a busy junction, a cement truck lost its brakes. The broadcast cut moments after the reporter was struck. Ramon Villarreal was 39 and had worked as a regional TV reporter for over a decade. He was not a national face, but viewers recognized him from morning weather hits and roadside updates during storms. He preferred fieldwork to the studio. Reporting live meant standing where things were actually happening, even when it was loud, hot, or uncomfortable. That afternoon, he stood on the shoulder near a concrete barrier, microphone in hand, traffic moving steadily behind him. Ramon had started in radio, then moved to television when the station expanded its local coverage. His job was practical: describe conditions, keep drivers informed, and get out of the way. He wore a reflective vest over a pressed shirt, an earpiece feeding instructions from the control room. The camera was framed wide enough to show traffic flowing downhill behind him, including a construction corridor used heavily by freight trucks. The slope was long and gradual, easy to underestimate. At the bottom sat a signalized junction that forced heavy vehicles to slow. Brake fade was a known risk on hot days. Earlier that week, transport officials had issued reminders about engine braking on descents, but enforcement was light. Ramon mentioned the congestion calmly, pointing behind him as he explained delays and alternate routes. As the live segment continued, a cement truck appeared at the top of the frame, moving faster than surrounding traffic. Its drum was full, the weight evident in the way the cab bounced slightly as it descended. Viewers could see it closing in quickly. Ramon kept speaking, unaware of the speed difference behind him. Seconds later, the truck swerved. Its brake lights flickered, then went dark. The sound reached the microphone first, a rising mechanical whine followed by a deep, uncontrolled roar. On the live broadcast, the truck veered left, clipped a sedan, and jackknifed. The drum shifted violently, pulling the cab sideways. The camera caught everything. The truck struck the concrete barrier and tipped. Ramon turned instinctively toward the noise just as the cab rolled through the frame. The front corner hit him at full momentum, throwing him backward. His body was driven into the barrier and pinned as the truck collapsed onto its side. The impact was brutal. Bones shattered on contact. The force crushed his lower body against the concrete, rupturing internal organs instantly. Wet cement burst from a damaged chute, spilling across the pavement and over him as the truck ground to a halt. The camera shook, then froze on the scene as the control room cut the feed. Emergency services responded immediately, halting traffic. Ramon was found unresponsive, pinned beneath twisted metal and hardening concrete. Extraction took time. The driver survived, citing brake failure. Investigators confirmed brake overheating and missed maintenance. The medical examiner ruled catastrophic blunt force and crush injuries, with loss of consciousness and no chance survival. The station suspended live roadside reporting indefinitely. The footage was never aired again, though some viewers remembered seeing the moment the broadcast cut. The intersection was redesigned months later with a truck arrestor lane added uphill. Ramon left behind a partner and 2 young children. His last broadcast was meant to warn drivers about traffic. Instead, it became a reminder of how quickly routine coverage can turn irreversible when heavy machinery, speed, and gravity converge in real time.
It was May 22nd, 2017, at a television studio in Los Angeles, California. The evening broadcast of a long-running game show was in its final segment. The studio was full, the cameras were running, and the energy in the room was higher than a normal episode because it was the season finale. Victor Hale was 58 years old and had hosted the show for 11 years. He knew the stage the way most people know their own living room. Every mark, every camera angle, every cue. That morning, his daughter had walked at her graduation ceremony. He had not been there. The broadcast schedule had made it impossible. He had arranged to meet her immediately after the show that evening and had mentioned it to a few people backstage. I want to sit with that for a second. His daughter's graduation. He missed it because of the show, and he was planning to make it right that same evening. But what happened next wasn't in the plan. The finale included confetti cannons, lighting transitions, and a descending prize platform operated through a stage lift system built into the floor. The lift used a trapdoor opening near the center rear of the stage. During normal operation, it sat flush with the surface, nothing to see. That evening, it did not. The finale sequence began. The music rose. The confetti cannons fired. The lighting intensified across the stage. Under the active lights and effects, the floor was harder to see clearly. That is not unusual for a production of that scale. The lighting was doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was hold the room and drive the energy of the moment forward. The audience looked up and forward. Victor moved across the stage as he always did during the closing segment, speaking to camera, pacing naturally, stepping backward as part of his delivery. It was the same movement he had made in rehearsal. The floor he expected to be there was not. His backward step found no surface. The support was gone before his body had time to register it. His balance shifted, and there was nothing to catch. He fell through the open stage aperture. The drop was approximately 18 feet to the lower stage area below. The fall drove the impact through his head, spine, and torso against the rigid surface below. He did not move after landing. On stage, the fall was partially obscured by the effects and limited audience sightlines in the moment it happened. The sequence continued for several seconds before anyone fully understood what had occurred. Audience members who saw it registered it as part of the sequence for several seconds before reacting. Production cut the broadcast abruptly as the floor team began reacting, switching away from the stage feed while crew accessed the lower stage area. Emergency services were contacted and paramedics arrived shortly after dispatch. Victor Hale was found unresponsive in the lower stage area. Resuscitation was attempted, but Victor was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was recorded as fatal traumatic injuries consistent with a fall from height onto a rigid surface. The investigation reviewed the stage operations log, the setup timeline, and the communication records from the production headset system. What it found was not a single mistake. Earlier in the day, a stagehand had accessed the trapdoor for alignment checks on the lift mechanism and had not reset it before leaving. No temporary cover or guard was placed over the opening. The required deck, clear, and stage-locked calls had not been issued or confirmed by the floor manager over headset before the live sequence began. No visible marking had been placed over the gap. Victor had not been told anything had changed from the rehearsed layout. Each of those things on its own might have been caught. Together, they were not. Victor Hale had been on that stage hundreds of times. He knew every mark on it. The one thing he did not know that evening was that the floor behind him was no longer there, and his daughter was waiting for him. That is the sentence I cannot get past. She had just graduated, and instead of seeing her dad, she got a heart-wrenching news.
It was November 26th, 2015, and downtown streets buzzed with holiday energy as crowds gathered for the annual Thanksgiving parade. The morning air carried a crisp chill at 42 degrees, with overcast skies threatening light drizzle. Colorful banners stretched across intersections while vendors set up along the sidewalks, transforming the usual business district into a festive corridor. Nella Quirk, 29, had arrived early to secure her position for the live broadcast. A freelance traffic reporter working on a short-term contract, she possessed the determined energy of someone building her career one assignment at a time. Fresh from journalism school, Nella approached each opportunity with meticulous preparation and genuine enthusiasm for field reporting. Her colleagues knew her as reliable and eager to take on challenging assignments that others might avoid. The production crew had positioned her directly beneath a steel camera cable stretched across the street at approximately 14 feet high. The cable system allowed for sweeping overhead shots of the parade route, capturing the full spectacle of floats and marching bands. Nella stood centered under the span, facing the camera with the parade route behind her, ready to deliver traffic updates as the procession moved through downtown. Technical crews had installed the cable system the previous evening, tensioning it between two utility poles to support the overhead camera equipment. The steel cable showed signs of wear near one of the mounting clamps, with visible fraying where the metal strands had begun to separate under repeated stress. Despite the obvious deterioration, no exclusion zone had been established beneath the cable, and parade operations continued as scheduled. As floats began moving down the street, Nella maintained her position for the live shot. The mounting clamp, weakened by the cable's fraying and sustained tension, reached its failure point without warning. The steel cable failed suddenly, sending the suspended camera rig swinging downward on its safety line. The heavy camera housing struck Nella across the shoulder and head, knocking her violently sideways into the path of a slowly advancing parade float. The impact sent her stumbling directly into the float's front wheel assembly. She fell beneath the vehicle's undercarriage, and despite the driver's immediate attempt to brake, the massive structure rolled over her torso. The weight of the multi-ton float caused catastrophic chest and abdominal injuries. Nella lay motionless on the street as parade personnel rushed to halt the procession, the overhead broadcast camera still transmitting the moment she was struck and pulled beneath the float. Emergency crews arrived within minutes, but the crushing trauma had caused irreversible internal injuries and massive hemorrhaging. Medical personnel confirmed death at the scene, attributed to multiple blunt force trauma and internal bleeding. The live broadcast feed continued for nearly 40 seconds before the control room abruptly cut back to the studio. Investigators later determined that the cable clamp had been improperly maintained by local technical operators. The frayed cable should have been replaced before the event, and safety protocols required establishing a clear zone beneath overhead equipment. The parade coverage ended abruptly, and subsequent safety reviews led to stricter equipment inspection requirements and mandatory clearance zones for future events. The incident prompted stricter standards for overhead rigging maintenance and mandatory safety clearance zones during live outdoor broadcasts. The network later settled with Nella's family, and city officials introduced new inspection requirements for all elevated technical installations used in public events. It was February 14, 2015, on a temporary ice road spanning the Red Lake River Basin near Red Lake Falls, Minnesota. The The morning was clear and cold, routine on the surface. Trucks idled in line as checks wrapped early. A live broadcast filmed preparations while winter weakened what seemed solid. Alexei Morozov was 36, an independent freight driver based in northwestern Minnesota, with more than a decade of winter hauling behind him. He owned his truck, an aging sleeper cab he kept running through careful maintenance and long hours. Alexei was known among brokers as cautious and slow to argue, someone who double-checked routes and declined work when conditions felt wrong. That winter, financial pressure influenced his decision to accept late-season work. A family medical expense had depleted his savings, limiting his ability to decline hazardous contracts. A regional television network partnered with a freight broker to cover late-season ice hauling during a live winter special. The focus was logistics, not spectacle, and Alexei was hired as a contract driver with hazard pay for one crossing. He was told the road remained open under reduced axle limits and speed restrictions after recent cold nights. He understood ice roads require sustained freezes, and that repeated thaw cycles had weakened the surface through uneven layers and subsurface erosion below. As the truck rolled onto the ice road, the live broadcast followed from a fixed camera on the riverbank, framed wide to show the full crossing. From that distance, viewers could see uneven color beneath the tires, dark patches where refrozen meltwater thinned the surface. Wind swept loose snow across the road, briefly masking long, faint lines in the ice. Near the midpoint, the failure became unmistakable on screen. The truck's headlights dipped sharply, and a dark crack split outward from beneath the front axle, visible even from the wide shot. A loud crack cut through the ambient audio. The cab lurched forward as the ice broke open, and black water surged up around the front wheels. The camera operator reacted late, the image shaking as the lens tried to zoom. Within seconds, the fracture widened. The truck tilted sideways, lifted slightly as the rear axle shifted, then dropped again as the ice collapsed under the trailer's weight. Water climbed rapidly along the doors. One headlight vanished, then the other. The image blurred as the camera lost focus, and the live feed cut abruptly, leaving only a rippling black gap in the ice where the truck had been moments earlier. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Rescue teams arrived about 18 minutes later, delayed by distance and unstable ice. By then, the surface had sealed, leaving faint bubbles beneath darkened patches. Divers recovered the cab hours later, after reinforcing the ice and cutting an access opening. That evening, the network returned live to confirm the death and suspend operations. The medical examiner ruled drowning, with cold shock contributing. Flooding triggered an involuntary gasp, drawing water into his lungs. Near freezing temperatures caused rapid muscle failure, preventing escape. No fractures or major internal injuries were found. Loss of consciousness would have followed quickly. The segment was pulled before rebroadcast. Public response led to stricter limits on late-season ice road filming and live coverage. The ice road was formally closed by county officials the following morning. It was June 12, 2015, in Las Vegas, Nevada. A live network stunt special was airing inside a packed theater, with camera rigs and stage lighting focused on a reinforced platform prepared for a real-time televised escape burial. Johnny Beaverton, 32, was the featured escape artist for the broadcast. He had spent over 10 years performing restraint and confinement escapes across regional venues and touring shows, building a reputation for technically precise, repeatable acts rather than spectacle improvisation. His burial escape had been completed more than 100 times using a standard enclosed box and layered soil. For the live special, production requested a modified version using a transparent, reinforced chamber, so cameras could capture his movements. Crew notes showed Johnny had completed partial rehearsals with the unit, but not under full burial weight. It also included a concealed low-flow airline rated for 15 minutes, built into the rear frame and tested during rehearsal. A chest strap heart rate monitor transmitted directly to the broadcast graphics system. Instead of dry soil, damp sand was selected because it settled smoothly on camera and reduced dust interference with lighting. Engineering staff approved the structure, but prep logs noted the total load weight was higher than Johnny's standard setup and required a revised base support plate beneath the chamber. Setup took place the afternoon of the broadcast. Sand was compacted in layers over the support frame. Later measurements documented uneven density across the platform surface, creating minor load imbalance points. The stunt included 2 safety systems, an internal mechanical release Johnny could trigger himself, and an external hatch override controlled by the stunt safety team. Because broadcast continuity rules required the stunt window to pass a minimum timer mark before standard hatch access. The external hatch was fitted with a timer-linked lock that prevented opening before a set mark unless a hard override key was used. That override key was stored at a secondary tool station behind the primary rail position. 8 minutes into the live burial, Johnny's heart rate rose faster than rehearsal baselines. His internal movement appeared more restricted than test footage showed. Under the uneven load, one lower support plate shifted slightly, transferring pressure toward the front frame. The distortion reduced clearance around the internal release linkage. When Johnny initiated the first escape step, the mechanism failed to travel its full range. The biometric overlay continued updating on viewers' screens. Elevated readings were initially interpreted by the control room as expected exertion within the planned struggle window, described during rehearsal briefings. The safety team remained in position, but standard entry required either timer clearance or the physical override key. When motion inside the chamber decreased sharply and the telemetry pattern turned irregular, the director called an abort. Crew began partial manual sand removal while the safety supervisor retrieved the override key and bypassed the hatch lock. The chamber was opened, but total access time exceeded survivable limits under compression and restricted airflow. On-site medics entered immediately and began resuscitation procedures without success. Beaverton was pronounced dead shortly after extraction. The medical finding listed compressive asphyxia with secondary oxygen deprivation as the cause of death. The formal investigation determined the fatal delay resulted from combined factors: increased apparatus weight, uneven base compaction, frame distortion, and a broadcast-linked hatch lock that slowed external access. Subsequent industry safety advisories prohibited timer-dependent locks on live escape stunts and required independent, instantly accessible mechanical overrides.
It was October 3rd, 2017, inside a broadcast production studio in Manila, Philippines, where a fire act that had been performed hundreds of times without incident was about to find the one condition that made all that experience irrelevant. Renato Dalisay was 34 years old and had worked Manila's small performance circuit for nearly a decade. Outdoor festivals, private events, tourist district showcases. Fellow performers described him as someone who drilled his technique until it was automatic. He had built a specific reputation for fire acts, and the televised talent competition was the largest platform he had ever booked. Reading this, I can't help but think how this is exactly the kind of moment people wait years for. Fire breathing leaves almost no margin for error. A performer holds fuel in the mouth and blows it across a flame so it ignites in the air, not inside. He brought his own fuel. The production's fire safety coordinator had flagged this before rehearsal and directed him to use the stage-supplied compound, which met the venue's specifications. The key variable is the fuel. Stage-grade paraffin burns slowly and predictably, while volatile substitutes can ignite too fast. When that happens, flashback can occur, sending fire back toward the face instead of forming a controlled plume. Renato declined, telling crew his personal blend gave him more consistent flame behavior and that he had used it for years without incident. The coordinator explicitly refused to approve the act with personal fuel, but a producer overruled the hold and cleared the segment to proceed. The schedule was tight, and the segment went forward. I personally think years of nothing going wrong is one of the most dangerous forms of confidence a person can carry. I think it's frustrating in a very specific way, because the system meant to stop this actually did its job and was ignored. The studio floor was acrylic paneled, chosen for its reflective quality under broadcast lighting. Several crew members noted before the segment that performers in earlier slots had struggled for footing on it. The production team did not install temporary mats despite known slipperiness. 4 overhead lighting banks ran at full intensity. Smoke machines fed a thin haze across the lower third of the stage. A fire safety officer stood in the left wing with 2 extinguishers. The nearest seated judge was approximately 15 feet from the performance mark. Renato stepped to center stage, ignited his torch, loaded the fuel, and squared his stance. The preparation appeared routine to everyone watching. With the main broadcast camera locked on him, he angled the torch and expelled the liquid. The flame ignited in a sudden flashback. Instead of a smooth vertical column, a chaotic fireball erupted back toward his face, clearly visible on the live broadcast feed, with uneven tongues of flame licking outward. His cheeks and mouth caught fire almost instantly, and small sparks splashed across the margins of his eyelids and periorbital area. The torch dropped. His knees gave and he went straight to the stage floor. The acrylic surface offered no grip. Crew in the wings had already begun moving before he landed. A fire blanket was placed over him within seconds. 2 extinguishers discharged across the stage as the control room cut the broadcast away from the performance. The fire on his clothing was controlled quickly, but the inhalation damage had already occurred. His breathing was audible from the wing, labored, deteriorating, accompanied by continuous coughing. I find it almost unbearable that people were already moving toward him and still couldn't close the gap in time. A producer on the stage floor called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived in under 5 minutes. Renato's airway compromise was severe enough that paramedics needed immediate airway management once they arrived. He was transported to the hospital where acute respiratory failure developed despite intervention. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as acute respiratory failure secondary to severe inhalation burns, with full-thickness contact burns documented across the face, periorbital region, and anterior neck. The production company issued a brief statement. Renato's family held a small service in Manila, attended mostly by performers from the same circuit he had worked for a decade. His personal fuel container was recovered from his kit bag and returned to the family with his other belongings. I feel like there's something especially quiet and heavy about this ending. No spectacle, no extended coverage, just a small circle of people who actually knew him.
It was July 2016, and the midday sky over Puget Sound in Seattle, Washington sat low and gray, the water moving steadily beneath the hull of the passenger ferry as the city's skyline held faint in the distance, and I still wonder why ordinary days like this always end with some bad news. Marina Hale was 41 years old and had been hosting live travel segments long enough that working outdoors in open conditions felt completely routine to her. She was composed on camera, comfortable with movement and ambient noise, and that afternoon she stood at the outermost railing on the wake-facing side of the ferry, with open water directly behind her and nothing between her and the sound. Colleagues described her as calm and self-assured on camera, someone who made live segments feel effortless no matter the conditions. And look, this was not an unusual setup. This was exactly the kind of shot travel segments are built around. She delivered her lines directly to the camera with the kind of practiced ease that comes from years of live work, her body slightly angled toward the lens while her back remained fully exposed to the water behind her. The camera was fixed, the shot was steady, and the segment was moving without interruption. The framing required her to remain aligned with the lens, limiting her awareness of activity occurring behind her, outside the camera's field of view. Floatplane traffic was visible in the background throughout, which was normal for that part of the sound. Scheduled routes crossed the area regularly, and nobody on deck was watching the aircraft, because there was no reason to. Marina continued speaking, and the camera stayed locked on her as a floatplane appeared in the background on what looked like a routine descending approach. And this is where everything changed. Within seconds, the descent shifted, the angle steepening and the alignment breaking away from a controlled glide path, and the aircraft hit the water not far behind the ferry at a shallow forward angle that sent a dense plume of spray upward and outward. Part of the aircraft's forward momentum carried through the impact, allowing debris to travel across the water's surface rather than stopping immediately. The debris field spread fast. Heavier components fragmented and moved outward along low trajectories, skipping across the water's surface while retaining part of their forward momentum from the impact. A dense fragment planed low across the surface toward the ferry. What gets me about this part is that Marina never had a single moment to react. She was mid-sentence, facing the camera with her back to the water, and the segment had not paused or shifted in any way that would have caused her to turn around. As the fragment reached the ferry's wake, the uneven surface disrupted its path and caused it to rise slightly above the waterline as it approached the vessel before striking her from behind with with significant force. She dropped out of frame immediately without any movement preceding the fall. The camera stayed on the empty space where she had been standing. That detail alone is the one I cannot shake off. Voices off camera began reacting without yet understanding what had just happened. The live feed continued for several seconds as confusion spread across the deck, and crew members moved without a clear picture of the cause. The director cut the broadcast and returned to the studio. Emergency response vessels were dispatched to both the crash site and the ferry as authorities worked to account for everyone involved. Marina Hale was confirmed dead from injuries caused by direct impact with aircraft debris, along with the occupants of the float plane. Investigators reviewed the footage, which had captured both the aircraft's water impact and the immediate sequence aboard the ferry in real time, making it one of the clearest recorded accounts of how quickly debris from a low-angle water impact can travel and the distance it can cover before losing velocity. Analysis of the footage confirmed that the debris retained sufficient kinetic energy over distance to remain hazardous beyond the immediate impact zone, and the thing that stays with me about Marina Hale is that there was nothing she could have done differently, not one thing. Now here is where this video takes a turn I wasn't expecting during my research, because every case so far had something completely outside anyone's control. It was May 8th, 2014, in Birmingham, Alabama. A live morning weather segment was underway in the parking lot of a regional news station as a supercell storm system approached the metro area. Broadcast vans were staged near the building, with a fixed camera and weather instruments set up to show real-time conditions as the storm advanced toward the city. David Chen, 51, was the station's chief meteorologist and had worked in on-air forecasting for more than 20 years. He was known locally for field demonstrations during severe weather, occasionally stepping outside the studio to show wind, rainfall, or hail intensity firsthand. His reporting style focused on practical safety guidance and visual examples, rather than studio graphics alone. In the days leading up to the broadcast, forecast models showed a volatile system capable of producing large hail and strong downdrafts, though early projections placed the most intense core slightly north of the station's location. Station planning notes showed the live segment was approved with safeguards. A news vehicle was positioned within a short sprint distance, and David wore a hard helmet with a clear face shield typically used for small hail and debris. The camera operator was placed behind a low concrete wall near the building entrance, using a zoom lens to maintain distance. The plan called for the segment to end once hail size exceeded safe demonstration limits, at which point the crew would move indoors and continue coverage from radar feeds. The live shot began shortly after 6:15 a.m. Light rain and small hail started within minutes, visibly bouncing off the asphalt. David demonstrated hail size comparisons using marked reference cards and advised viewers to avoid windows and seek solid cover. Wind speed increased rapidly as the storm cell shifted track. Radar updates relayed to the control room showed the high-intensity core trending closer than earlier projections indicated. Hail size increased from marble to golf ball diameter in less than 2 minutes. Impacts became loud enough to register clearly on the broadcast microphones. David moved toward the news van as planned, using it as partial cover while continuing to speak to camera. As he reached the vehicle, a cluster of larger hailstones struck the windshield and hood almost simultaneously. One impact fractured the outer layer of the windshield glass, sending a burst of laminated shards inward through the already lowered side window opening used for cable routing. David recoiled and lost footing on the accumulating hailstones underfoot. He fell backward onto the pavement, striking the rear of his head against the curb edge beside the parking divider. The camera, still live, captured the fall from a distance as the operator took cover from the intensifying impacts. The segment audio recorded the control room calling for an immediate cut as the signal switched back to studio radar. Crew members reached David within seconds, once the largest hail burst past. On-site staff initiated first aid, while emergency services, already on severe weather standby, were dispatched to the station. He was transported to a nearby hospital with severe head trauma and skull fracture. He did not regain consciousness and was pronounced dead later that morning. The incident review concluded that the fatal injury resulted from secondary impact trauma during rapid hail escalation, not direct hailstone penetration. The station updated its field demonstration policy to prohibit outdoor live shots once hail exceeded preset size thresholds, and required all severe weather segments to maintain fully enclosed shelter positions. It was April 14, 2015, in a Midwest television studio buzzing before airtime, crew footsteps echoing under fluorescent lights beside a hastily built wooden platform raised 18 inches above concrete. Javen Trott, a 42-year-old morning show host, arrived earlier than usual that Tuesday. His weathered face showed the confidence of someone who had spent decades in broadcasting, first behind radio microphones, then transitioning to the physical demands of television. Known for his ability to improvise during live segments, Javen had built a reputation for making even mundane furniture demonstrations feel engaging to viewers across the region. His colleagues often remarked on his natural ease in front of cameras, a skill that had made him indispensable to the morning programming. Despite his experience, he maintained an approachable demeanor that resonated with audiences. The studio was understaffed that morning. The previous night's extended sports coverage had run late, leaving the technical crew with minimal time to properly inspect the set pieces. The plywood platform, designed to elevate the furniture display area, showed visible flexing during earlier rehearsals. A surface crack running along one edge had been covered with tape rather than properly repaired. The construction had been rushed to meet the morning deadline, with corners cut to save both time and budget. As the segment approached, Javen positioned himself near the platform's edge, handheld microphone in hand. The wide studio camera captured him in frame as he prepared to demonstrate a living room arrangement. The concrete subfloor beneath the temporary structure remained exposed around the platform's perimeter, creating an unforgiving surface below. Studio lighting created stark contrasts across the set, making depth perception challenging. When the live broadcast began, Javen stepped backward onto the platform as he had done countless times before. The plywood immediately split along a load-bearing seam. His right leg dropped through the opening, causing his torso to pitch forward violently and throw his upper body head first off the platform. His chest struck the sharp edge of a wooden coffee table with significant force, knocking the wind from his lungs. The impact sent him tumbling off the platform entirely. The back of his skull struck the bare concrete floor with a sharp, hollow impact. His body went still almost immediately, one arm twitching briefly before falling limp. A dark stain began spreading beneath his head as the wide studio camera remained on him for several seconds, capturing the motionless form on the floor. The microphone clattered across the floor, still transmitting audio. For nearly 10 seconds, the live broadcast remained on the fallen host before the control room abruptly cut the feed to black as crew members rushed onto the set. Without proper medical equipment on set, their attempts at stabilization proved limited. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but by the time they reached the set, Javen showed no pulse and no signs of breathing. Resuscitation efforts continued during transport, but he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, with doctors confirming that the head impact on the studio floor had been fatal. The investigation later determined that the platform collapsed due to structural failure and the lack of a required pre-broadcast safety inspection. The temporary structure was not rated to support the load, and the visible crack should have forced an immediate replacement. Shortly afterward, the station permanently canceled the morning show. Viewers who had watched the collapse live later learned that the host died on the studio floor from a skull fracture caused by the fall. The studio was closed for review, and new inspection rules were imposed for all temporary sets. It was August 7, 2016, at a temporary motocross circuit outside Seremban, Malaysia, where a regional sports channel aired the championship round live. The afternoon heat hung over the dirt track. Grandstands were packed, engines revved, and the broadcast opened on riders lining up beneath sponsor banners. Arif Rahman was 26 and a well-known rider within local motocross circuits. He wasn't famous nationally, but locally he mattered. He grew up riding on palm oil service roads, worked weekdays at his uncle's motorcycle shop, and raced every weekend he could afford tires. Regular spectators recognized his number from regional events. He was known for clean landings, smooth throttle control, and taking risks only when the points justified it. The event was a freestyle-heavy format added to boost attendance. Riders were scored not just on lap time, but on aerial tricks performed over a widened tabletop jump near the main camera tower. The jump had been reshaped overnight to look bigger on television, with a steeper face and longer gap. Riders were warned that spacing would be tighter and timing critical. The heat made the dirt dry and loose, reducing traction on approach. Arif qualified well and entered the final run in third place. He needed a high-difficulty trick to move up. He had practiced a no-hander variation during warm-ups, but only once on the rebuild jump. Track officials kept the program moving to stay within the broadcast window. There were no extended gaps between riders. Engines roared continuously, and dust hung in the air. As the final run began, the live coverage followed the jump from a fixed sideline angle. Arif accelerated cleanly and launched high, releasing both hands mid-air as planned. At the same moment, a rider behind him, misjudging the spacing, hit the jump too early. The second bike rose faster and lower, drifting offline. The collision happened in the air, fully visible in the broadcast frame. The front wheel of the second bike struck Arif across the torso and shoulder. The impact twisted his body sideways while both bikes continued forward. Arif lost grip and separated from his motorcycle. The second rider clipped him again as they fell, sending Arif rotating headfirst toward the landing zone. Arif hit the dirt with extreme force. His helmet struck first, snapping his neck forward before his body folded beneath him. The second bike landed on top of him, the rear wheels spinning briefly against his back before stalling. The sound cut through the crowd, metal, plastic, and a dull impact that did not resemble a normal crash. Arif was motionless in the churned soil as other riders braked hard to avoid him. Officials rushed onto the track. The broadcast shifted to a wide overhead view as medics reached Arif, who did not move. His helmet was cracked at the chin bar. Emergency services were called immediately, and the race was stopped. Medical crews attempting resuscitation before the broadcast briefly returned to confirm a serious accident and then ended early. Arif was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at a nearby hospital. The post-mortem report listed catastrophic head and cervical spine trauma, along with massive internal injuries caused by blunt force. The collision in midair had delivered energy equivalent to a high-speed road crash, with no chance for protective gear to absorb it. Loss of consciousness would have been immediate. An investigation found that the modified jump reduced safe separation between riders and that no enforced delay existed between freestyle attempts. No charges were filed. The second rider survived with broken ribs and a fractured arm. The event was canceled permanently the following year. The track was leveled within weeks. The broadcast footage is never replayed, but many in the crowd remember exactly where they were standing when the engines stopped.